Welcome to the tactical preview of Newcastle United versus Manchester City. In this series, what I try to do is predict City's starting 11, offer some insight into City's opponent, provide an opinion on how the game is going to go, and offer a score prediction. Get your score prediction in the comments section of the video. Without further ado, let's get straight into it, shall we? Newcastle, I feel like are potentially being a little bit underrated by a lot of City fans going into this game. It is true to say that they've not been especially good this season. They've lost their two most recent league games in a row against West Ham and Brentford. Not ideal. That being said, they've only lost 3 times at St James's Park, and they were against Barcelona. They were against Arsenal, who required a last-minute winner, and Liverpool, who required a last-minute winner. So this isn't going to be a walk in the St James's Park. See what I did there? I don't think it's going to be that easy. The other thing to say is that this team from Newcastle, this lineup, doesn't look especially frightening. There's going to be quite a few changes here, though. So Tonali was a potential injury doubt. Eddie Howe has said that he's almost definitely going to be starting. Same with Joe Linton. He picked up an injury against Brentford. He's got over that. He's going to be able to start as well. So sadly, from City's POV, it is going to be this very dangerous triumvirate in the centre for Newcastle. Very dogged, resolute, athletic, physical, commanding midfield, which is also very technically gifted up against City, who have been accused of being a little bit lightweight in the midfield. That's not ideal. They're all almost definitely going to start. The other thing to say is that one of the reasons why Newcastle have been so lacklustre this season relative to last season it's partly because Isak has gone, and Votemard is a good striker, but as we'll get into, perhaps isn't quite there in terms of the outer possession work compared to Isak. The fullbacks has been the key area for concern. Trippier has been past it for at least a year, maybe even more so by now. No disrespect to Trippier, but I think that's safe to say. And Dan Burn is an immobile centre-back being played at left-back. Dan Burn's also irrelevant for the purposes of the City game because he picked up a suspension. Conversely, Eddie Howe has said that Lewis Hall, Livramento are now in contention to be starting the match against City, which would be a massive difference offensively, certainly for Newcastle. They would have so many other options because, once again, Trippier's a bit past it. Dan Burn's massively immobile, not going to offer anything necessarily creatively going forwards. Livramento and Hall, on the other hand, they can overlap, provide width, they can underlap, provide that threat. They can also invert into the midfield, no problem, because they are very versatile, technically competent players. Generally speaking, they build out with a 4-2-4. Out of possession, this is what we see here, a 4-5-1. There are a couple of weaknesses in this structure that we've seen so far from Newcastle, and that's even with their core midfield 3, and that would even be with the 2 fullbacks returning. And that's basically because when Newcastle engage high up the pitch, they do commit a lot of bodies forwards, and they do want to try to win the ball back in the very early stages of an opponent's build-up, especially when they lose the ball high up. They want to counter-press, get it back. Once the ball gets to a more settled area of the pitch, they will become incredibly passive and will just be more than happy to set up in this 4-5-1 mid-block. It's not a problem for them. Votemada is essentially a non-issue for the opponent. The other thing, and this is a potential weakness that City can perhaps exploit, is that massive gaps are created between their defensive line and their midfield line. Huge gaps, which I can't really explain why. I suppose it's because of the lack of engagement lends itself to allowing the opponent to get access and get into these pockets of space, and too easily can they get overloaded in those areas. So take, for example, the Brighton game. This is the opening goal. So Newcastle, in theory here, there's no counter-attack here. There's nothing untoward going on here. Like, Newcastle aren't caught out. This is a standard settled defensive position for Newcastle, a standard settled possession state for Brighton. But look immediately, first of all, Votemada's not doing anything RE the pressing, as I outlined earlier. Even if he did, I don't think that's because of like laziness, by the way. He's being instructed to like almost lead the press all on his own. He's being massively outnumbered here. There's nothing he can do. He's essentially a non-factor there. As we advance on, those are the gaps that I was talking about before. So there's Newcastle's back line. The left back is just out of shot here. And there's their midfield five. Once again, the striker not really doing anything. How many Brighton players there have just been able to really easily drift into the spaces and the gaps between the defensive line, the defensive four, and that passive midfield five? Far too easily. No one's really engaged and switched on. Once again, it's a very passive setup. And one ball in fizz by the centre-back into the midfielder. Now imagine if this is now one of Guardiola or Diaz, or Nunes if he's played at right centre-back, or Kusanov in fairness. Imagine if this is now one of those players fizzing it into one of City's excellent small space players, such as, let's say, Shirky. He receives it, turns, Newcastle's midfielders nowhere near him, Tonali, Bruno Guimaraes nowhere near him, just able to evade them and get away far too easily. And because there was so much of a gap between the midfield line and the defensive line, he can just turn and run quite freely because the defensive line weren't pushed up to stop a run, so he's got loads of grass to just eat up and run into. The striker is stretching them also, and it's just one ball through, and Brighton score from it. That is how I would suspect City can get some joy in this game if Newcastle set up how they did and how they have this season. Against Barcelona, when they went to St. James's Park, maybe this is a better game to use because this is also going to be at St. James's Park, and you'd expect City to have a lot of the control as Barcelona did. Newcastle were a bit more adventurous in their pressing, once again only really in the earlier stages of an opponent's build-up, but they were very good at disrupting the build-up. They forced Barcelona to go out wide, so they weren't able to congest the centre, and Newcastle did get some joy in that sense. So our fullbacks will perhaps have to be switched on from a first touch point of view if Newcastle do deploy that intense press. It's key to note they weren't able to maintain that throughout the entire 90 minutes against Barcelona. One of Newcastle's biggest weapons in that game, or rather the way that they tended to try to build up against Barcelona, was to go very long. Very interesting how eager they were to just give the ball away. So if that does happen, and if it is Voltemada starting, who's obviously a big bulky man who can excellently hold at the play, then our centre-backs are going to have to be ready for that eventuality. Thankfully, Ruben Diaz has been fantastic with aerial duels defensively this season, so I would back Diaz to win that encounter more often than not, based on this season. Not something I would normally say, but based on this season, he has been fantastic therein. So that's Newcastle. Brief overview. Manchester City now. Based on all of that, what should City be doing to counteract Newcastle? What were their biggest strengths, their biggest weaknesses that I just outlined, and how can City circumvent and exploit Newcastle? Their midfield, historically, whenever I've been contemplating Newcastle, the first thing I think of is that midfield three. Joelinton, Tonali, Bruno Guimaraes. Very physical, very athletic, very dangerous, also technically sound. Arguably the most dangerous midfield in the Premier League on those parameters alone. People have been suggesting, including myself, that perhaps this is a game where you would play both Rodri and Nico Gonzalez in the midfield to really bring some steel, solidity, physicality to the midfield. Unfortunately, Rodri has confirmed as not being available at all. He's not able to start. Kova is still out, but he's going to be out until February anyway. Hopefully Rodri comes back soon. There is nothing that Manchester City can do to win the physical midfield battle, in my opinion, without Rodri. Even if Rodri were here, it would be challenging. But as we saw against Bournemouth, and as we saw especially against Liverpool, and as we saw when Barcelona went to St. James's Park, there is more than one way to win the midfield battle. I touched on this in the Liverpool tactical preview, and I recommended this midfield three, and there were lots of Liverpool fans licking their lips when this lineup came out, and it was Nico, Bernardo, Foden, and they thought that players like Gravenberch, Szoboszlai, McAllister were going to eat us alive. Did that happen? No, it didn't, because they were not, I mean, in fairness, Liverpool were just not good enough in their pressing, but even when they were in those moments, we simply outnumbered them. So what I'm going to suggest, and this is quite boring, is the exact same structure as we have seen for the past 2 games now. That is what I would like to see. I want to see the 2-3-5 in possession with the overlapping fullbacks, who can, of course, start a little bit deeper initially in those earlier phases if Newcastle do deploy that high press. But in those final stages, get the fullbacks high and wide, allow O'Reilly and Doku to rotate, for example. We know why this works. We've seen why it works. You're always going to outnumber the opponent in the midfield. We saw our midfield do like a rondo training drill around Liverpool's midfield. And I'm not suggesting that we're going to dominate their midfield in that sense, but there is the possibility to do that if you have these tight space, press-resistant midfielders centrally outnumbering and therefore overpowering the opponent's midfield, not through athleticism and physicality and strength, but simply just numbers and knowing that you're not going to lose the ball, but you can also be a creative threat. That's what I want to see. I want us to be exploiting the space in between these lines with players like Doku, Cherki, Foden, Bernardo and Nico potentially dragging in Newcastle's press to afford the space for these players and to enhance the gaps between the defensive line and the midfield line to make the Voltemada pressing even more of a non-issue. In fact, that being a non-issue, maybe that drags out some Newcastle defenders out, and then City can exploit that. That's the other thing to note. I can't recall the exact graph, but Newcastle are one of the worst sides this season in terms of conceding opportunities from transitional moments. Now, City are not a pure counter-attacking side, but when City suck in the opposition like that, as we did against Bournemouth, and as we did against Liverpool, we created artificial transitions time and time again, compact the centre, force them to come centrally, and then hit them on the counter out wide. Not really the counter, because you haven't lost the ball, but then just hit them out wide. I think the City can potentially do that. If it's Trippier at right back, we have to do everything we can to get Doku pinned onto him consistently over and over and over again. That absolutely must happen. That's another area of weakness if it's Trippier starting rather than Livramento, let's say, because maybe he's not able to start. I know I started the video by saying this is going to be a tricky game, and I do still believe that it's not going to be a walk in the park at all. A walk in the St. James's Park. I made the same joke twice. That's how funny I am. But I'm quietly confident that City can get the win if we set up as we did against Bournemouth and as we did against Liverpool. I don't want to fix what isn't broken. I understand why you might want to play Savio instead, because maybe you want to play Kusanov in case Gordon's starting because you want to deal with his pace. But Nunes is also a quick player, and if you play Kusanov right back, it's going to be very hard to fit Cherki into the side. And I think that Cherki is a player who's going to relatively easily pick apart this passive mid-block from Newcastle. It does also require really tidy small space operators. That's why I'm going to advocate for Bernardo starting again rather than Reinders, who I was going to say I haven't put him on the bench, but I have put him on the bench there, who hasn't started the past couple of games, and that's a shame for him. But Bernardo's been so crucial for us in these big games when we've needed that technical ability in deeper zones and that tidiness in possession, knowing you're not going to lose it. Bernardo's been fantastic there. So those are my predictions as to the lineup. It's boring. I'm sorry. I'm predicting the exact same starting 11 for City, but I think there's a reason. I think it's a fair call to predict the exact same starting 11. Let me know if you'd make any changes. Rather, let me know if you think there'll be any changes. Get your score predictions in the chat as well, in the comment section, sorry. I'm going to say that City will win this game 1-0. Oh, it's going to be a frustrating game to watch. Don will keep the clean sheets, and hopefully we'll just keep Newcastle quiet generally, because we've been pretty defensively sound so far this season. And of course, you know who's scoring. Erling Haaland, as always. Thank you so much for watching. Really hope you enjoyed this tactical preview. Brief analysis as always, but hopefully you got some value from it. If you did, There are a few things you can do. You can leave a like on the video. That's free. It helps support the channel. If you want to go the extra mile, you can either join the Patreon or you can become a YouTube member. The links for both of those are in the video description, and the Hall of Fame is on the screen right now. Thank you to all of my supporters. In particular, shout out to my beautiful highest tier supporters across Patreon and the YouTube membership: Tony, Spartacus, Silver Splits the Blue, Ethan Larios, Austin King, and Rowan.